Hello, welcome to Summer Books. I'm here today to chat with Adelle Purdham, author of I Don't Do Disability and Other Lies I've Told Myself. I was really looking forward to this conversation, and I think you'll find it so relevant and so useful in the society that we live in today. Adelle, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's so nice to have you here. Why don't we just begin by you telling us a little about yourself?
Oh, sure. I am a mom to three girls. My oldest is 13. Ariel. My middle daughter, Elise, has Down syndrome and she's 12. My youngest is 8 years old. So three girls, mother of daughters, and I'm a writer. I teach sessionally as part-time faculty at Trent University. And yeah, I think of myself as a disability parent advocate as well, or ally, disability ally.
Mhm.
Um, in that my writing touches on, yeah, topics of advocacy.
Okay, so maybe we can talk about how you got into that work. I know you mentioned that your daughter has Down syndrome, and you are an ally. How did you? Okay, so first I should say that your book is titled "I Don't Do Disabilities and Other Lies I've Told Myself," which is such a great title for a book. Can you tell us about like where that came from? Like the name itself and just the backstory of how you came to writing this book.
Sure, absolutely. So how I came to writing this book is complex. I mean, there could be many stories that I could tell, right? But I
Mhm.
think one that stands out in my mind is when Elise was born. Um, I remember going into a local bookstore
Mhm.
and looking for a book written by a young mother who had a child with Down syndrome, someone like me, right?
Mhm.
I was 28 years old when I gave birth to her. And simply put, that book wasn't there. And not only was there not a memoir, but there wasn't any book about Down syndrome in the store. And that really spoke to me about how we view people with disabilities in our society. We treat disability like it's invisible. And it also made me feel like nobody cared,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
And I had this strong feeling of, well, I care, and I don't want another parent to ever feel this way. And so that's one that's one version of the story I can tell. And that's very true. And that sort of set me off on my advocacy journey that um, ended up me wanting to write about my experiences with disability parenting. And so I began writing for newspapers and magazines, blogging, all of these things. And then I wrote a complete memoir, but that book ultimately did not get published. I think sometimes it takes writing the first book to get to the second, truer story. And in my case, coming back to your question about the title,
Mhm.
I Don't Do Disability. Go back to when I was 16 years old. So this is sort of the other story
Okay.
where I'm not the hero of the story. This is where, you have like the rub, right?
Mhm.
So when I was 16, I had been, just to give you some context about the kind of person I was, I, I was this A student, competitive gymnast,
Mhm.
driven, walked to my mom was a school secretary. I would walk down from my high school to her school to teach kids gymnastics. I did all of this volunteer work. And one day I just sort of had this epiphany. Like, I'm in my school selling lollipops to raise money against child slavery. I'm raking leaves for the elderly in my neighborhood. I'm, at food drives. I'm doing all these different things. But it occurred to me, I had this very distinct thought.
Mhm.
Why am I not volunteering with people with intellectual disabilities? And I very quickly came to my own rescue in
Mhm.
my head and said, that's okay. I just don't do disability.
Right.
And with that proclamation, I had, I dismissed 25% of the world's population, essentially. And I also, I thought that if I distanced myself
Mhm.
from the idea of disability or people who had disabilities, that I could keep disability, like it was like this separate construct, like I could keep disability away from myself and from people that I loved. Like that was maybe my thinking at the time. And then fast forward to 12 years later,
Mhm.
and I give birth to a daughter with Down syndrome. And now that story can no longer hold, right? All these ideas that I had in my head about what it meant to be disabled, um, those stories just couldn't hold anymore. And so this book is really an exploration of me confronting my own ableism as a mother to a child with Down syndrome.
Yeah.
Ableism just being the belief that an abled body is better, sort of how I think of it.
Mhm.
So that's where the title comes from. And I think when I was 16, around that time, that was like the 2000, there was this there, like, that was like a saying at the time. Like there's a reason that I would have thought that. It was kind of
Yeah.
like, I don't do this or I don't do this. And so I was like, I don't do disability. So that's where it comes from.
Right. Okay. Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that. It's
My
interesting
pleasure.
how it's interesting how um like what the thing that happened to you way back then when you were younger, like a child or a teenager, um came back, full circle, and you had to confront it directly. We as people don't really take the time to actually learn about these disabilities, or like any specific disabilities, or even other things like other forms of discrimination. We don't take the time to learn about these different people well enough to understand that, what, they're just people like the rest of us are. So then we absorb all these prejudices and biases, and we apply them, unfortunately, in the systems that we work within. So education, your employment, or whatever the case may be.
I think you've said this beautifully. Like we inherit this, and
Mhm.
it's not an inheritance we want.
Yeah.
And what you're referring to, that form that I took, and I am, repurposing it, reclaiming my daughter's identity. But
Mhm.
that came um, from Dr. Catherine McKersher. She wrote an
Mhm.
incredible book, Shut Away When Down Syndrome Was a Life Sentence, about her experience of being 4 years old. I think she was four, and her younger brother, who had Down syndrome, being taken from their family and placed in institutional care, right?
Mhm.
Again, if you can call it that. And basically, she's a journalist, was a professor, and dove deep using her family's narrative and her brother's story, but also like dove deep into the history of institutionalization in Ontario.
Mhm.
Anyway, when I read that book, it was like a physical blow to me. But I asked her, would I be able to use
Mhm.
the form in the, like, I just got that idea. I had been, I think I went to a workshop on using hermit crab essays where you use borrowed forms. And I had this idea, like that was something that really bothered me, like all the paperwork and how it adds, I don't know, it adds layers of shame and guilt, or I don't know what it does,
Yeah.
but it's not a good feeling. And she was like, absolutely. So that was actually the form Catherine McKersher's mother
Mhm.
filled out in the 50s when she was told by medical professionals to put her child in an institution, right? At 2 years old, where he suffered horrendous abuse and dehumanization, right? That's what these places became.
Mhm.
But that is the context that we've inherited as a society. The 50s, 60s, 70s, medical professionals telling families, your child is, this baby is better off in an institution, right? And
Yeah.
then, so it isn't really a surprise to me when I, like, knowing that and feeling that and like seeing how those attitudes still impact how people with Down syndrome are treated today.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I definitely plan to read Dr. Catherine's book. when you talked about it,
Mm,
so sure this is something I want to look at. When when you said I don't do disabilities at the time, and then when
mhm.
later on, when now you were expecting, did it occur to you that, oh, I had said this before, or is this something that came to you much, much later when you were writing?
I think, I mean, I think we remember certain memories or things that have been said for a reason.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
These things stick in our mind for a reason, but certainly that memory surfaced from the depths of somewhere when I was writing. I guess, interestingly enough, so I have an essay by the same name as the book title. The
Mm-hmm,
titular essay is called I Don't Do Disability.
mm-hmm.
And that is the first essay that I knew I wanted to write for this book. Like,
Yeah.
or, and it took me the longest. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I must have, like, I knew the name of the book right away.
Oh yeah.
Like I had the essay, I had the name of the book, I had to write the essay. You don't really know how that's going to take shape until you
Mm-hmm.
actually do it. But that memory must have been one that I knew I would write about. Like that was sort of the core. That was
Right.
a part of like a big core. But there was another when I think about um I mean this is crafted though too, right? Of course.
Yeah.
Like and I think we reshape the stories in a way by writing about them.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So it's interesting as well, probably how much that story has been shaped by me, but it's true as far, emotionally and as far as I can recall. But
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah, anyway,
Yeah.
I
No, of
hope that
course.
answers that.
That your response there is a very MFA graduate response. Like someone who studied the art of putting a story together. Um, so I really appreciate that because after I mean we both did the same program. So for those who are watching, Adele, I actually got to meet Adele during my MFA program at the University of King's College. And so, yeah, hearing you talking about it that way is like very studious. I like it. So tell
Thank
me,
you.
yeah, tell me about how you talk about very early on in the book, you talk about how um, you got the diagnosis that your daughter has the marker for Down syndrome. Um, and then the doctor kind of presented options for you. And then you also
Hmm.
talk about how your your third child. So Ariel, Elise is your second child,
That's
right?
right.
And then your third child, I'm not sure I remember the name.
Penelope.
Penelope, yeah. So
Yeah.
Penelope was the third child. Is your third child. And when she was born, there was a comment that was made that kind of got you thinking about, but what does that mean in relation to my second child? So
Hmm.
you talk about these things to kind of highlight how when a child is born with Down syndrome, it's seen as a negative. Can you,
Hmm.
discuss that with me a little bit more?
Yeah, let's talk about that. I think there are really subtle ways that people signal in our society,
Mhm.
subtle and not so subtle, right? Like subtle ways that we signal um, this child's life is worth less. This person with Down syndrome's life is worth less.
Yeah.
Like the very fact of being asked, would you like an abortion? Down syndrome in and of itself is not a medical condition,
Hmm.
right? It's associated with many medical concerns. Um, but that being said, children with Down syndrome, you have 3 copies of the 21st chromosome, you have extra genetic material. Um, but by no means is that baby otherwise unhealthy, right? And so I guess in retrospect, looking back and comparing my birth experiences and seeing that like the sorrow, the sadness. It's a very common response if you say, my child is going to be born with Down syndrome or my baby has Down syndrome, like, oh, I'm so sorry. Right. And that's so painful. It's so I mean, I had a really great social worker we met with
Mhm.
before Elise was born. And now this is 12 years ago. She's 12 now, but who had said how you choose to frame the message that your child will be born with Down syndrome is going to, or, not always, but will, drastically help how those around you and shape how those around you
Mhm.
respond. But again, if I think about that now, it was good advice. It allowed me to move forward in a positive way because I myself felt grief over her diagnosis
Yeah.
initially. And, um, but that puts all the onus on the parent, right? And not the things in society. Like I'm thinking of it, I don't know if this is the right term,
Mhm.
but it's like microaggressions. It's
Yeah.
like with racism, right? Or like where you can't always certain things you can pinpoint, but other things
Mm.
come out subtly.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, like the midwife saying to me, you know, this I hope, I'm glad you had that nice birth after Penelope, my third, was born,
Mm.
after that last time. And I knew what she meant. I did have a great birth with Penelope. It was a home birth. It happened in 2 seconds. Like it was like she just came flying out, right?
Yeah.
And at least I was in the hospital. It was medicalized. I wouldn't choose that for myself, right? But
Mhm.
that isn't the full extent of what was meant behind that statement. It was, and I don't even think all of these things are done or said consciously.
Mhm.
I don't want to I don't want to I don't want to, you know, be too critical of someone for I think our society is inherently ableist.
Oh
And
yeah.
so people are saying things and doing things all the time and it's actually just normal, which things need to change.
Oh yeah.
Right? And just
Mhm.
pointing some of these things out like how would a mother carrying their typical child feel if the doctor said, oh, and on your next checkup, just needed to check this off. Would you like an abortion today? Or like
Yeah.
it really points in a direction, in my opinion. Now, again, I'm going to acknowledge my privilege. I'm going to acknowledge um, that I also want to acknowledge like a woman's right to choose and to her own body, right? I
Mm.
support all of those things, but I also support balanced information being given when a woman is receiving any sort of diagnosis, right? Um, yeah.
So, if you don't mind my asking, when you get that information at the hospital or at the clinic with your doctor, do they
Mm-hmm.
then like give you an education before saying, okay, so this is what you can do? Like, did they, or do they just say, okay, this is the diagnosis and you can keep the child or not? I don't actually.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's going to depend high risk obstetrician to, like how an OBGYN delivers that
Mhm.
information. Ours was excellent, but it was actually part of the standards of care, I
Mm,
believe, to offer an abortion. Like, I don't even think the doctor had a choice as to whether that it was
right.
just like these are the things that you do. But when she delivered the information, she didn't say it sadly. She didn't try to sugarcoat anything
Mhm.
because, you know, if there's any sadness I feel now, it's over the challenges that we face societally,
Right.
right? And the challenges that my daughter has in and of herself are real as well. And
Mhm.
we've also gone through the ringer with medical concerns. But that's none of these things make her life less
Yeah.
important to me or to just being here,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think having talked about how the doctor had to follow this standard of what? Standard of like I guess
I
the
think standard of care is what I'm
standard of
calling it,
care.
which is seems quite
Yeah.
ironic. Yeah.
So I think because they have to follow that, that's just one example, but a lot of things in our society are built in a way, like the system is built in a way that
Mm-hmm.
it's inherited from, like way back then, right? So
Mm-hmm.
whatever people believed 10, 20, 50 years ago continues to be carried forward. And so you find that you continue to suffer the discrimination that's caused by these things because it was built in way like in the past. So I think at some point in your book you talk about how like the form, if you found a form that was used
Mm-hmm.
um in an institution, a hospital
Yes.
type institution, where
Yeah.
people with disabilities would be sent to, right? It wasn't just people, it wasn't
Yeah.
just children, and it wasn't just Down syndrome. And that form like had very disturbing questions, right? And I think a lot of these
Mm-hmm.
things like they continue to trickle into our society now. Plus,
Yes.
we as people don't really take the time to actually learn about these disabilities or like any specific disabilities or even other things like other forms of discrimination. We don't take the time to learn about these different people well enough to understand that, you know what, they're just people like the rest of us are, you know. So then we absorb all these prejudices and biases and we apply them, unfortunately, in the systems or that we work within. So education, your employment, or whatever the case may be.
I think you've said this beautifully. Like we inherit this. And
Mm.
it's not an inheritance we want.
Yeah.
And what you're referring to, that form that I took, and I am, repurposing it, reclaiming my daughter's identity. But
Mm-hmm.
it's that came um, from Dr. Catherine McKersher. She wrote an
Mm-hmm.
incredible book, Shut Away When Down Syndrome Was a Life Sentence, about her experience of being 4 years old. I think she was four, and her younger brother, who had Down syndrome, being taken from their family and placed in institutional care, right? Again, if you can call it that. And basically, she's a journalist, was a professor, and dove deep using her family's narrative and her brother's story, but also like dove deep into the history of institutionalization in Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, when I read that book, it was like a physical blow to me. But I asked her, would I be able to use
Mm-hmm.
the form in the, like, I just got that idea. I had been, I think I went to a workshop on using hermit crab essays where you use borrowed forms. And I had this idea, like that was something that really bothered me, like all the paperwork and how it adds, I don't know, it adds layers of shame and guilt, or I don't know what it does,
Yeah.
but it's not a good feeling. And she was like, absolutely. So that was actually the form Catherine McKersher's mother
Mm-hmm.
filled out in the 50s when she was told by medical professionals to put her child in an institution, right? At 2 years old, where he suffered horrendous abuse and dehumanization, right? That's what these places became.
Mm-hmm.
But that is the context that we've inherited as a society. The 50s, 60s, 70s, medical professionals telling families, your child is, this baby is better off in an institution, right? And
Yeah.
then, so it isn't really a surprise to me when I like knowing that and feeling that and like seeing how those attitudes still impact how people with Down syndrome are treated today.
Yeah. Tell me
Thank you.
who you're hoping or who you would like to read your book and why.
If I think back to that bookstore moment
Mm.
where um, I needed that book
Yeah.
about Down syndrome and it didn't exist. Now,
Mm.
I will tell you, there are lovely Down syndrome memoirs written by parents out of the US, but I will also say this is not really a Down syndrome memoir either, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
these
Yeah.
are literary essays. So I think there's really something there for the disability community, especially parents. I want mothers to read this. I want women to read this book. But of course, I mean, you're never allowed to say this, but I would want for everyone to read this book. I hope that
Yeah.
that you know, we all walk into a text with our own experiences. So I think anyone who would read it would come away with something different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it isn't, so I was saying it like this book, there's the and the other lies, right? I don't do disability and the other lies I've told myself. And the other lies, this idea, I didn't want to write just about my experience with disability parenting because I want to push back against this stereotype that if you are a mother to a child with Down syndrome, that that is all that you are.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to offer this countercultural view of like, and this is my life. I have many identities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I write about many different facets. So I think, uh, but especially, I think there are a lot of the stories are about parenting. So, you know, those are sort of like the primary audiences I think of for this book first. Parents and the disability community and anyone interested in social justice issues,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Awesome. So one of the things I really enjoyed in your book that is not about disability and it's not about your child is the way you talk about um, things in nature. I found that like very
Mm.
I think it's the depth of 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 those topics that you go into. You know, like when you talk about um, the loons
Mm.
at your cottage. You know, you there's a way that you talk about them and their lifestyle, the way they live together, and what the sounds mean and how you call to them. That I thought was very, what's the word? Like it just got me to look at nature in a different way. You know, especially for somebody who's not like I'm not someone who
Mm.
hikes or spends all that time out there. It was really interesting to kind of be pulled into that space where I got to appreciate nature more because of the way you wrote about it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I absolutely love nature. Sorry, were you going to say something else there about that? Oh,
No, that's it.
okay. I really appreciate you saying that. I think I wonder if maybe it's just the kind of writer I am or person that I am, but to be honest with you, we these essays, many of them came about organically,
Mhm.
right? They're kind of pieces of me, but it was sort of like what was going on in my life. I wrote this book mainly during the time I did my MFA at King's and then a
Yeah.
year afterwards. Of course, some of the stories go back to childhood and I jump around, but the nature element, I think I almost became like we moved to our cottage. I write about that,
Mm.
but it's almost like, yeah, I became porous and just sort of soaked in the nature around me.
Mhm.
And, but why I also think it's important, the
Mhm.
very first time I finished reading my entire book, I wanted to read it like a reader. You know, I
Mhm.
had just put all of the essays together and
Mhm.
I read it and I sat there for 4 hours and just read my book in one go. And I got to the end and my feeling was just trying to be an outsider, which is
Mhm.
probably impossible, but my feeling was these stories, these essays, this book is about our interconnection to each other, to the natural world.
Mhm.
And I
Yeah.
think seeing the world through the lens of disability parenting now, which now I just do, right? I see the world differently
Mhm.
after having my daughter in my life. I describe it as in one way, I used to be sitting up on my high horse, and now I've got 2 feet on the ground, firmly planted
Mhm.
on the ground, and I'm standing looking at the people next to me, right?
Mhm.
And that includes the natural world and just the idea that we are all connected. And so, therefore, we should look after each other and we
Mhm.
should look after the natural world is so important to me. And I think speaks to like my secret mission in writing this book, which is
Yeah.
I'll just say it out because I feel like sometimes you can't just say things directly, but I'm going to say it. My secret mission is just to like shout my love for my daughter from the rooftops,
Yeah.
right? And so I think this idea of connection, this idea of unconditional love, this is my message and my
Mhm.
feelings and my belief.
I love that. I think it's very important because as we've talked about, it's the way that the world sees children who have Down syndrome or people with Down syndrome or any other disability. People see them in a way that yeah is less than, right, and for you to like push back against that message, I think that's so important. And I do agree with you, everyone needs to read this book, not just people who are somehow like directly impacted, because like those people who have experienced it in some way are the ones who will immediately pick up the book when they see it, right? But I think there is something about reading about experiences of people, about experiences with different disabilities, because then it kind of helps you to like open your eye a little bit more. So I really do
Of
think that
course.
it's important that as many people as possible read this book. um
Thank you.
is there anything else that you would like to share with readers?
Mm. It is an immense honor to just get to share my work. And this has been this book really, so I mentioned that I wrote a complete memoir before. So
Mm-hmm.
this has been, it was sort of an 11-year process to publication. So if there's any other writers out there or someone else who's working on their story, I always just like to say that your story's important and it matters, like it matters deeply, and that just don't give up, right?
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, that's probably the most important thing for all the writers out there. Like, don't give up. You have a story to tell and you'll find the right reader. I ended up my publisher, or sorry, my acquisition editor at my
Mm-hmm.
publisher. My publisher's Dunder and Press.
Mm-hmm.
But Megan Beadle, the acquisition editor for my book. This is kind of wild. I only recently found out this story
Mm-hmm.
at my book launch in Peterborough. But she couldn't be there because she's dealing with chronic pain. She
Okay.
herself is disabled. So
Mm.
they talk about in publishing writing the best damn book that you can, right? Make sure the writing is flawless, sparkling. Um, like having something unique to say, right? What is your unique story? But then also there's this element of like luck, right? So for me, I happened to get my manuscript. Okay, I had submitted to a contest at Dunder, and before they kind of knew about
Mm-hmm.
me, but I nothing had happened until my book got in Megan Beadle's hands.
Mm-hmm.
And she said to me, and I had no idea about this until recently, that it was the exact book that she needed to read to be able to accept her like her own identity of being disabled.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of blew my mind in a way, and my heart, like just you you can be that for someone. You
Right.
can help them understand something about themselves or feel seen. Like I wanted to write this book too for like to make my daughter and myself whole, right? To be seen as whole people. And so anyway, it was a stroke of luck in a way that Megan happened to be the one to read it.
Right.
I hope that it could have resonated with someone else in a different way, but it also happened to be a book she enjoyed, but a book that also really meant something to her personally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I just love that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, and
Yeah,
that's a good connection. Like you guys connected nicely on that. That's amazing.
it is. It's such luck, but it also is just hard work, right? I would never accept for myself if someone said, "Oh, you got lucky." I say, "Nope, I
Yeah.
worked really hard for
Yeah.
11 years." And I know every writer does. Like to and you do it because you love it
Yeah.
too, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to know about your work. We need to have another interview. I want to know about your work.
I can tell you about that once I hit stop record. Then we can.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. Um,
Thank you so much.
yeah, you are welcome. I was just gonna quickly say that fierce love is what I felt for your daughter in your book as I was reading it.
I love that. And I've been signing my books. Be fierce in love.
Oh, really?
I love that.
Wow, that's
Okay, I
so
love that
funny.
you felt that.
Passion. Make sure you get a copy of I Don't Do Disability and Other Lies I've Told Myself at tosummitbooks.com. You can find the link just below this video. And please subscribe so we can continue to explore important topics and have a chance to discover incredible authors such as Adele.